Entire rice paddies gone. Wetlands stripped bare. Canals choked with toxic pink eggs. Not by drought, by a snail. Apple snails are tearing through the American South, Southeast Asia, and Europe, and nothing is stopping them. They eat everything, breed constantly, and carry parasites that can kill. But what if the most destructive freshwater invader in history could be worth $2 billion a year? This is the apple snail story you've never seen. In the United States, wildlife managers are now contending with an estimated 2 million invasive apple snails spreading through Louisiana, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The species at the center of this crisis is Pomacea maculata, the island apple snail, one of the largest freshwater snails on Earth, capable of growing to the size of a baseball. It is not native to North America. It evolved in South America, where it lived inside a balanced system of predators, competitors, and environmental constraints that kept it from overwhelming everything around it. The story of how it got here is almost too simple. Apple snails entered the American pet trade in the 1980s, sold cheaply in aquariums across the country under names like mystery snail or spike-topped apple snail. Aquarium owners who tired of them or couldn't keep up with their reproduction dumped them into local ponds, ditches, and canals. Some escaped from ornamental water garden facilities during floods. From those first release points in Florida and Louisiana, the population did exactly what any biologist paying attention would have predicted. It exploded. The numbers are what keep state wildlife agencies awake at night. A single female island apple snail can lay up to 2,000 eggs per clutch in those unmistakable bright pink masses that coat every reed stem and canal wall in infested areas. She can produce multiple clutches per month throughout the warm season. The eggs are coated in a toxic protein called PCPV2 that makes them unpalatable to most native predators. The hatchlings that emerge are immediately mobile, immediately feeding, and immediately capable of destroying submerged aquatic vegetation faster than it can regrow. In field studies conducted across Louisiana rice parishes, a single acre of infested paddy can lose its entire crop stand to apple snail feeding within 3 weeks of transplanting. The economic damage is not theoretical. Louisiana alone, which produces roughly 20% of all U.S. rice, has recorded crop losses attributed to apple snails running into tens of millions of dollars per season in the most heavily infested parishes. Across the southeastern United States, total agricultural and ecosystem damage estimates now exceed $500 million annually when wetland restoration costs, water management disruptions, and lost rice production are combined. Federal and state agencies have responded with mollusicides, copper-based chemicals that kill snails on contact, but which also kill native bivalves, crayfish, and amphibians throughout the treated area. They have organized egg mass removal programs, paying volunteers and contractors to physically scrape pink egg clusters off vegetation by hand. They have experimented with biological controls, including introductions of predatory crayfish and native birds trained to associate snail habitat with feeding sites. Nothing so far has moved the population in the direction that matters. Then the trappers and the processors showed up, and the math started to look different. To understand why trapping works where chemicals have failed, you have to understand how apple snails move. Unlike a pest that hides, an apple snail is surface-oriented, slow, and predictable. It feeds in the top 18 inches of the water column. It moves toward dense vegetation. It follows water temperature and photoperiod with the reliability of a clock. Miss once with a chemical application and the surviving population rebounds within a single breeding cycle. Build a trap in the right location with the right attractant, and you can intercept the same snails that would have produced 10,000 offspring before the month is out. One of the biggest mistakes in early apple snail trapping programs was building traps too small and placing them too far from active feeding corridors. A proper commercial snail trap in a Louisiana rice context is a submerged wire mesh enclosure, typically 4 to 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep, with funnel-style entry points on each end. The mesh is sized to allow juvenile snails and native species to pass through while retaining the large adults responsible for most of the reproductive pressure. USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service trial data from pilot programs in Jefferson Davis and Acadia parishes confirmed that correctly sized and positioned traps running a vegetation-based attractant averaged 200 to 400 adult snails per trap per night during peak feeding season from May through September. At the same time, modern monitoring technology has transformed what was once a labor-intensive guessing game into a data-driven operation. Submersible cameras paired with wireless transmitters allow trappers to monitor snail activity at each site without wading into the paddy every morning. Water temperature sensors trigger alerts when conditions push snail activity into its highest range, between 77 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit, telling operators exactly when to check and reset. A fully instrumented trap line across a 500-acre rice farm can now be managed by a single operator covering the entire property in a morning. And still, the hardware is only half of it. Because drawing snails into a trap in the first place is an art form as much as a science. The most effective commercial bait protocols combine two things that apple snails cannot resist: decomposing aquatic vegetation and fermented grain. Operators build bait packages from bundles of dried water hyacinth or cut rice straw, soaked in a mixture of fermented rice bran and molasses for 48 hours before deployment. The resulting scent plume disperses downstream through the water column for hundreds of yards. Apple snails, which locate food almost entirely through chemoreception, follow it directly into the trap entrance. Some operators add a secondary attractant, crushed calcium carbonate, chalk dust essentially, which mimics the mineral signature of high-quality food sources that snails associate with productive feeding grounds. The result is a trap that doesn't just catch snails that wander past. It actively pulls them in from across the paddy. The story of one Louisiana rice farmer makes those numbers real. On the outskirts of Crowley, in the heart of Acadiana rice country, 58-year-old Thibodeau Fontenot had been farming the same 800 acres his father cleared in the 1970s. By 2021, apple snails had made 2 consecutive planting seasons nearly unviable. His transplanted rice stands were being cut down at the seedling stage, and the molluscicide applications he had been relying on were killing his crayfish ponds, a secondary income stream he could not afford to lose. He came close to converting the entire operation to dry land crops. Instead, he partnered with a state extension program and installed a 40-trap line across his most heavily infested paddies, following protocols developed at Louisiana State University's Ag Center. He baited with fermented rice bran, checked the traps every 48 hours, and delivered the catch to a licensed processing buyer operating out of Lafayette. In the first full season, his trap line removed over 14,000 adult snails from the property. Seedling survival in the trapped paddies ran 20 percentage points higher than in the untreated control sections. His crayfish ponds, freed from chemical pressure, recovered to near normal productivity by the second year. The revenue from selling snails to the processing buyer did not replace his crop income, but it covered the full cost of the trap program and then some. He calls it the first management tool in 5 years that actually moved the needle. Once a trap is full, the clock starts immediately. Apple snails in a crowded trap stress quickly, and stressed snails begin to release mucus compounds that can affect meat quality within hours. Experienced operators work their trap lines before dawn, reaching the processing handoff point within 4 hours of collection. The animals are kept in aerated water transport tanks at all times, never piled dry. Leave that window and the processor notices it in the product. And nobody in the emerging snail market pays premium price for degraded product. Wild-caught apple snails destined for human consumption in the United States move through a supply chain that is still being formalized, but which already has functioning nodes from the Louisiana Bayou to specialty seafood markets in New York, Houston, and Los Angeles. The snails are transported live to licensed facilities where they undergo a mandatory purging period of 48 to 72 hours in clean, recirculating freshwater. During this time, they clear their digestive tracts completely, a critical food safety step because apple snails in infested agricultural waterways pick up pesticide residues and heavy metals from sediment. After purging, the animals are inspected under protocols developed in consultation with FDA, with particular attention to Angiostrongylus cantonensis, the rat lungworm parasite that apple snails can carry, and which causes eosinophilic meningitis in humans if consumed raw or undercooked. Properly heat-treated snail meat, cooked to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, eliminates all known parasitic risk. Every commercial processor in the emerging U.S. market is required to document cook temperatures by lot. The inspection and processing infrastructure is modeled partly on existing frameworks for crawfish, another Louisiana freshwater species with a well-developed wild harvest-to-market pipeline. Because apple snails vary significantly in size, from golf ball to baseball, they cannot be processed with the mass throughput equipment designed for uniform commercial shellfish. Processors use a tiered sorting system, separating animals by size class before cooking. The largest animals, above 80 grams, are steam-cooked whole and the meat extracted for restaurant-grade whole snail presentations. Mid-size animals go into minced and ground product lines. The smallest, retained snails, those still above minimum size for legal harvest, are processed into snail meal, a high-protein aquaculture feed ingredient that has found a ready buyer base in the tilapia and shrimp farming sectors, where it competes favorably on protein content with imported fish meal. What makes wild apple snail meat commercially interesting is the same thing that makes it ecologically problematic. The animal eats voraciously, grows fast, and builds dense muscle tissue. The resulting meat is lean, high in protein, and carries a mild, clean flavor that chefs who have worked with it describe as somewhere between abalone and little neck clam. It holds up well to heat, absorbs aromatics readily, and presents well in both classical French preparations, think escargot style with garlic butter and herbs, and in Southeast Asian cuisines where apple snail dishes like hoi jark have been eaten for generations. In Vietnam and the Philippines, where Pomacea species have been established and partially integrated into local food culture for decades, snail dishes are street food staples, not novelties. American specialty food buyers, particularly those sourcing for high-end restaurant groups in cities with significant Vietnamese and Filipino communities, have been the first consistent domestic market. Beyond fresh and frozen meat cuts, wild apple snail is being processed into a growing range of value-added products. Snail sauce, a fermented condiment in the tradition of fish sauce, is in early commercial development by two Louisiana-based producers. Dried snail meat, shelf-stable and shelf-attractive in the growing protein snack category, is being piloted in natural food retail. The protein-dense snail meal product going into aquaculture feed is perhaps the largest near-term commercial opportunity because it scales with the trap volume in a way that the premium food market, limited by consumer familiarity, currently cannot. The economics of the whole system, from trap to table to feed mill, are what make this more than a niche curiosity. A single commercial trapper running 100 traps across a 500-acre operation during a full Louisiana season, May through October, can harvest between 50,000 and 80,000 pounds of live snail. At current buyer prices ranging from 40 cents to $1.20 per pound, depending on size and intended use, that represents gross revenue of $20,000 to $96,000 from what was previously a liability and a cost center. Multiply that across the 400,000 acres of rice farmland in Louisiana alone that carry significant infestation pressure, and the theoretical scale of the industry becomes clear. The $2 billion figure in the headline of this story is not a projection pulled from thin air. It is the number that emerges when you apply similar math to the full infested range across the American South, factor in the feed and specialty food markets, and add the avoided management costs, molluscicide, hand removal, crop loss insurance that a functioning trap and process industry displaces. That industry does not fully exist yet. What exists is the beginning of it. Working trap programs, functioning processing nodes, a regulatory framework being built in real time by state agriculture departments in Louisiana, Florida, and Texas, and a small but growing market of buyers who have tasted the product and want more of it. The infrastructure gap between the current pilot scale and the economic potential is real, and it is significant. It requires investment in processing capacity, in cold chain logistics, in consumer education, and in the kind of stable buyer relationships that give trappers confidence to expand their operations. None of that happens overnight. All of it is moving. This is the part of the story where honesty matters. Apple snails are not going to be eaten into oblivion. The reproductive biology is too powerful and the infested range is too large for any harvest program to eradicate the population. What a functioning trap and process industry can do, what the early data from Louisiana pilot operations already suggests it is doing, is suppress snail densities in treated areas to levels where rice production becomes viable again, where native aquatic vegetation begins to recover, where the management burden shifts from a pure cost to a partially revenue-generating activity. The goal is not elimination. The goal is management at scale. A pest that generates economic value gets managed permanently. A pest that generates only costs gets underfunded, undertreated, and eventually left to expand. The apple snail, for the first time in its American history, is starting to generate value, and the farmers who figured that out first are already running the numbers on next season's trap lines. For years, every assessment of the apple snail situation in the American South ended in the same place. We were losing. The biology of the snail was outrunning every management tool available. Now, for the first time in specific parishes and specific fields, the numbers are moving in the other direction. Not because of a chemical breakthrough, not because of a federal program, because a handful of farmers and trappers looked at the problem and asked a different question entirely. Not how do we kill it, but how do we use it? The answer is still being written, but the trap is already in the water. If this story opened your eyes to what's really happening in America's waterways, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we go inside the battles that most people never hear about. The farmers, the trappers, the scientists working the problems that don't make the evening news. This is exactly the kind of story we tell. Don't miss the next one.